If there's one thing that grinds my gears, it's bad adaptations of games. Because the main problem that comes with these adaptations is the intention, as well as the lack of respect and passion behind them. That's why some of my favorite game-based movies of all time are the Need for Speed and Assassin's Creed movie. Because not only are they based on game franchises that I love, but there's clear effort and passion that went into these two movies. Even if they slip up on a few things that prevent them from being great films, the overall film still tries to do something interesting while also respecting the source material in some way. You might have heard the term the video game movie curse. This is a term that shouldn't have existed in the first place. The reason this term exists is because the people behind these movies don't respect the source material or forget how to make a good film first and foremost. These terrible video game movies are nothing but cash grabs, which is unfortunate, because so many of these adaptations had great potential. And I wish I could say that the devs behind the games shouldn't let this happen. I feel like the devs or publishers should have sent in narrative consultants or supervisors to make sure that the story or script makes sense to the source material, while still allowing for creative freedom. Then we wouldn't have more stinkers like the Doom movie or the original Mario movie. Although I do see the Mario movie as more of a testing ground to see if game to cinema adaptation works to begin with. But every video game movie that came after, like Max Payne, Dead or Alive or Hitman, were just embarrassments. The Dead or Alive movie shouldn't have even existed, because what is there to translate other than sensual multicultural women? This video is an examination of what goes and what went wrong with the video game movies over the years. A problem that has plagued both the gaming industry and the film industry for decades. It's a problem that easily could have been avoided a bit earlier, but studios still continue to produce garbage films under these popular game IPs, because they have the wrong idea and intentions. You could argue that interactive storytelling can get in the way of translating from game to cinema, but at the same time it is possible if you understand the source material and how to implement certain factors into cinematic form. A lot of things in these popular games can be done in film form in very interesting ways. Let's take Hitman. The Hitman games rely on stealth as well as open-ended gameplay. Now sure, the open-ended gameplay can't be implemented into the film, but the opportunities given in the games sure can. The two Hitman movies had so much to work with in terms of what made the Hitman games what they were at the time. Silent Assassin, Contract and Blood Money clearly prioritized interesting social stealth and compelling ways of getting close to your target. The only real problem that comes with Hitman's stealth is just how slow it is, but with some appropriate and maybe even stylish editing and writing, speeding up the stealth for a film really shouldn't be a problem. A proper Hitman movie that tries to implement core Hitman features could possibly be one of the most intense and compelling spy thrillers in the film industry, if done in a clever or creative way. It's possible. But sometimes the filmmakers just don't know what makes the games tick in both the gameplay and the story department. There's no research. Which begs the question, why don't the developers actually supervise or give a summary to these studios telling them what defines their IP? Because a large majority of the crappy video game movies are due to the filmmakers or studios not even understanding the source material. But back to Hitman for a second. While the first Hitman movie wasn't really good overall, I do have to admire it for at least occasionally paying respects to the source material of the time. There's quite a bit of notable moments that are reminiscent or clearly inspired by the games. That first movie showed us that under all the garbage writing and direction, they at least had some sort of understanding of what makes the games tick. There are many times where 47 does what he canonically does in the games. He disguises, tails his targets, snipes from a distance, plays smart. Hell, he even walks accurately to his earlier games, which actually makes me respect this movie even more. The story wasn't all that good or interesting and the characters were flat as a wall, but it's better than whatever the second movie was trying to do. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that the first Hitman movie was actually so close to being one of the best video game movies. The biggest slip up was its story and the directing. Otherwise, it did, to an extent, understand what makes the Hitman games what they were. You see, when it comes to adapting any source material from any medium, compromises have to be made. Whether it's removing a character from a novel so that the story can fit into a movie, or modifying story elements or characterization from a comic so that it works within movie logic. Things like that. But the Hitman movies made heavy compromises. They scrapped a core part of the IP's identity, which resulted in movies that feel like terrible fan fiction and generic action movies under a popular IP. Same thing with the Resident Evil movies. The first movie, while not great, at least had a bit of that suspense and terror of the games. Until later movies just threw that out the window to make these shallow action horror movies that aren't remotely accurate to the games. The only video game movie that I can think of that actually respected the source material but still tried to be its own thing with the help of somebody who actually works on the lore and overall narrative of the games it's based off of is Assassin's Creed. Now sure, there were some questionable choices made during this film, but at least there was ambition and supervising from officials, although with some studio interference. Let's start with the good. This is one of the only video game movies that, in my opinion, actually somewhat improves on what's been presented in the games. Because in the games there was something called the bleeding effect that kind of only made sense within game logic. But the movie carefully twisted and expanded the concept of the bleeding effect to work within the logic of a cinematic environment, while also making more sense of the concept than the games ever did. Lastly, the bad parts. Although it's promising to have actual members of the original source material on board with the adaptation, you still have to realize that creative freedom is important. What Ubisoft should have done with this movie is provide a script or story bible of sorts to the studio and allow the rest of the movie to form. But instead, Ubisoft interfered too much with the story of the film that a lot of scenes and interesting story beats were scrapped from the final film. This led to the final film being faithful to the source material, sure, but at the cost of a movie that feels unpolished and unfinished. The director of the Far Cry and Postal movie, Uwe Boll, is notorious for making these bad video game movies. So notorious that when a Metal Gear Solid movie was considered, with Uwe Boll being involved, the video game mastermind Hideo Kojima himself said, "It's impossible that we'd ever do a movie with him." Uwe also tried to get on board for the Warcraft movie, with Blizzard saying, "We will not sell the movie rights to you, especially not to you." But the Warcraft movie ended up being eaten up by critics anyways, even though I fairly enjoyed it. In fact, I blame Uwe Boll for bringing on the video game curse in the first place, since he put so much salt into the wound that his whole career thrives off it. He ruined video game movies that weren't even supposed to be made in the first place. I mean, Far Cry, as a soon-to-be franchise, hadn't even found its footing until a few weeks after the movie came out with Far Cry 2. Postal was not movie material. To some it was barely even proper game material. Alone in the Dark, which is considered to be one of the worst movies of all time, had its script corrupted by Uwe because he added a bunch of other ideas from other successful action movies that weren't true to the source material, and said that the script didn't have enough car chases, which is mind-boggling. He turned a horror movie into a full-blown action movie. He also made the Blood Rain movies, which are basically just B-movie adaptations of a game series that already had an identity crisis. Blood Rain didn't know what it was then, and it still doesn't. The point I'm trying to make here is that a lot of adaptations are made for the very purpose of earning a few bucks instead of trying to make a good movie, and that intention leaks into the final product in the worst ways. Admittedly, I think it's fine to not stay fully faithful to the source material, but as long as you make up for it by making a good movie based on the IP and or within the boundaries of the IP, like Detective Pikachu or the recent Sonic movies, then being faithful to the source material should be the least of your worries. Because these failed adaptations aren't good movies in the first place. They end up losing more money than what was intended, because if there's no care or passion behind these products, why should we care or be passionate about your product? And it's been like this since the inception of video game movies, which has, again, been decades. Where did this mentality come from? Where adapting something suddenly means you forget the basic rules of what makes a good movie. The whole point of adapting something from a different medium is to have it adapt to the ways and structure of a chosen medium, as well as introduce and intrigue the world to this franchise or series through said different medium. What do people like in a good movie? A well-told story, memorable characters, entertaining moments, interesting storytelling techniques, well-directed scenes, compelling acting, and consistent pacing. Now, I'm not a filmmaking expert, but why is it that all these game adaptations just throw these components out of the window? And while I love the Assassin's Creed movie, I unfortunately have to critique it here. This movie is made by the same people that made 2015's Macbeth movie, and that movie was top tier in my opinion. The story was well told, the pacing was great, the acting was even better, and it was just an overall well made and well thought out movie. Assassin's Creed carries over a lot of what made that movie great with a lot of the same team, but on the narrative department it does something questionable, and this again is due to Ubisoft taking too much creative control. Now, I don't think the movie's story is bad by any means, it's how they decided to tell the story that prevents me from thinking it is near perfect. You see, the story holds back in the worst possible ways. You can feel the story is building up to something greater, which is great on paper, but the story as a whole ends up feeling like a long prologue or trailer, which is the problem. The story feels like nothing more than a prologue. It feels like throughout the movie, the story is still beginning to tell its story, and while a lot happens, there's not much fleshing out that's being done. Everything in the story is either a setup or a sort of inciting incident, but nothing follows. It fails to flesh out a lot of the core story elements, it merely just sets them in place. The antagonist and the weapon they're searching for aren't fleshed out, so we end up not seeing the true risk. If you've played the game, then you know, but it would have helped to see it in movie form to understand the stakes. You see what I mean? It's either an adaptation forgets the source material, isn't a good overall movie in the traditional sense, or is all of the above, and it infuriates me. So here's some quick advice. Plan out a good movie first, then implement the source material. Or know the limits of the source material, and then use it as a sandbox to come up with a good movie. Now sure, easier said than done, but it's the best way to go about it and it always has been. Sonic and Detective Pikachu prove that the source material just needs to feel appropriately implemented into an overall good movie, and you have a great adaptation. Same thing with the movie adaptations of books. Look at T2 Trainspotting for example. That movie was lightly based off the Trainspotting novel's sequel, Porno, but they felt like it would make a better movie if they went their own route and made a slightly more emotional follow-up to the original movie based off the original Trainspotting novel. Because of that, T2 Trainspotting is one of the best sequels I've ever watched. They prioritized making a good movie over being fully faithful to the source material, but still respected said source material, which was the smartest thing to do because I don't feel like T2 would have worked as well if it was completely based off Porno, especially after the time gap between the release of both movies. Need for Speed also does this well. The movie clearly references each era of the Need for Speed series, but still does its own thing and still tries to be a good and entertaining movie, even if people didn't quite see how underrated the movie actually was. I actually would have forgiven the Hitman movies for wrongfully portraying the leading man if they were well done movies, but they're not. They have stories that aren't that compelling, the directing is pretty bad, and everything else is just alright. A lot of people say that the storytelling and certain actions in games don't work in movies because they lack that interactive aspect. Except they can and do work without the interactive aspect. If it works in a comic book, I believe it can work in a movie for sure. Take Assassin's Creed for example. Assassin's Creed has games, novelizations, and comics. Each medium complements the overarching narrative and universe of Assassin's Creed very well. Original story or retelling, interactive or not. So it can damn well work in a movie form given the right planning, passion, and polish.